Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP, which is an interdisciplinary research program designed to offer innovative policy recommendations for emerging economies. The initiative aims to offer sustainable policy options to assist governments in pursuing their development priorities while considering the environmental and economic costs. As a result of this project, Johns Hopkins SAIS will be a leading voice in offering pragmatic but effective approaches to providing the world's population with affordable and abundant energy at minimal environmental impact. The founding director of ISEP is Professor Johannes Urpilainen, who is the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor of Energy, Resources, and Environment at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I'm very proud to welcome him as one of our new senior faculty in this field and the director of our ERE program. And he only joined us this fall, so it's wonderful to see that he's already spearheaded this initiative during his short period of time at the school. In establishing this initiative, Professor Urpilainen has already set an example of the in-depth and rich educational experience available to our students, one that marries academic scholarship with policy-relevant and real-world challenges. At Johns Hopkins SAIS, he teaches action-oriented classes on energy and environment policy to equip the next generation of global leaders with knowledge, analytical skills, and a passion for transformational social change. And as one of the world's top energy experts, he frequently advises governments, international organizations, foundations, and private sector on energy and environment. Professor Urpilainen received his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in 2009 and spent the next 8 years at Columbia University at the Department of Political Science. He's an award-winning author of 4 books and over 100 refereed articles on environmental politics, energy policy, and global governance. Joining him in a conversation would be Ms. Rachel Kite, the CEO and Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All. Ms. Kite is a leading advocate for sustainable development and believes affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy are key to combating poverty and climate change. As Special Representative for the Secretary General, she is the point person in the United Nations for action towards 2030 global energy goals on universal energy access, sustainability, and renewable energy. Until 2015, Ms. Kite held a position as World Bank Group Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change. She also held other prominent positions as World Bank Vice President for Sustainable Development and the International Finance Corporation Vice President for Business Advisory Services. The recipient of numerous awards for women's leadership, climate action, and sustainable development, Ms. Kite is also a professor of practice in sustainable development at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She also holds a master's degree in international relations from Fletcher, which she and I share, and a bachelor's degree in history and politics from the University of London. And at this time, I would like to ask Ms. Kite to come to the podium to deliver her remarks. After she speaks, we will hear from Professor Urpilainen, and after their presentations, they will join the audience for a conversation about sustainable energy policy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, I think, by now. And Dean Nasser, thank you very much. Professor Urpilainen, Thank you for this wonderful invitation. What a great opportunity this is, what an important new initiative this is, and what a great moment for a Fletcher graduate to be able to talk to you at this time. I have a stool behind me just because I'm slightly incapacitated after having gone hiking on the weekend and slipping and twisting my knee, and I'm heavily drugged, and so therefore nothing that I say today, no, seriously, everything is on the record. I'd like today to give you a little sense of, from the perspective, the wonderful privilege that I have as the Special Representative of the Secretary General, but also as CEO of SE for All, Sustainable Energy for All, a little overview of where I think sustainable energy policy could really help us in our move through a smooth and speedy energy transition. I believe that this initiative by Johns Hopkins, by SAIS, led by Professor Erpelainen, that this is really one of those moments where we're looking at the right issue at the right time, in the right place. It's important to ensure that we agree on what the challenge is before us. After all, the words sustainable and energy have not always sat comfortably side by side in the same sentence in energy governance fora, or frankly in development fora for that matter. But in 2017, we are 2 years into a 15-year time frame for the Sustainable Development Goals, which everyone signed up to. And we are 2 years past the critical bottom-up agreement that formed the ambitious climate agreement in Paris. From these two agreements and from attendant international agreements such as that in Addis Ababa on financing for development, we can say that the exam question facing us, and perhaps part of the exam question facing the initiative, is what policy innovation and what degree of coherence is needed to ensure provision of energy services that will provide reliable, resilient, affordable and cleaner energy to all by 2030 and ensure that the energy systems are decarbonised as close to mid-century as possible. That's debate, discuss, deliver. Embedded in that question are many elements of the energy transition. Some of those elements are already benefiting from the advance of technologies and the falling prices of some of those technologies. Some of the elements of this transition are benefiting from advances in business models made possible by advances in information technology, in mobile banking, in other advances. Some of the elements of the energy transition are benefiting from advances in thinking about decentralization and how to deliver decentralized systems. Some are benefiting from advances in digitalization. And some elements of the energy transition are kind of stuck. They're not moving fast enough, weighed down by past decades of inertia, perversity in public spending, special interest groups, lobbying, poor management, failing institutions, and a lack of innovation. Some elements of the transition are candidates for behavioural economic thinking. Some are candidates for better data and understanding. Some will attract private investment, some won't. But together we are talking about a step change in the need for policy to enhance the ability of the public sector to contribute to a partnership with the private sector for delivery of sustainable energy for all. Today, I'd like to talk about a few of the challenges, those that lie ahead. And I know that there's a focus very much in this new initiative on South Asia, and I think it's true to say that the pathway to success goes through South Asia. It is impossible to achieve the SDGs or the Paris Agreement Agreement or any other major agreement, I would have thought, in sustainable development without seeing South Asia succeed. And so I will look at it from a global perspective, but there are very specific dynamics at play in South Asia, which will be very important, and helping the countries of South Asia to ratchet up their ambition under the Paris Agreement between now and 2020, and helping them succeed in some of the milestones that they've already set for their own sustainable development, and helping those countries within South Asia that are a little further behind and a little less focused on sustainable energy get going will be critical to the planet and to broader society's success. So I have 7 challenges. First, access to electricity. Surprisingly, this has not been the focus of energy policy for many countries, including those with the largest energy access gaps, necessarily in the past. Just over 1 billion people do not have access to electricity today. We've made significant progress in understanding who those billion people are and what levels of access they do not have access to. So this isn't just about getting everybody a light bulb, right? This isn't just everybody getting a solar lamp. This is really determining what are the best solutions to reach the mainly rural population in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't have access to anything. And then what are the business models to help them move through a curve to get access to more power, more reliably for longer periods of time? And then what are the business models to help those in those rural areas, but also those in peri-urban areas in the cities of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia in particular, get access to the reliable, affordable energy that they will need in order to really start running businesses. And all the way through to then making sure that that 24/7 cleaner, reliable, resilient energy mix is there for everyone. So about half of the billion that don't have access to electricity today are in South Asia. There's been phenomenal progress actually in Sri Lanka, parts of India, Bangladesh, using different business models, different public policy, different institutions, different models of rural electrification, but still a long way to go. And there is a huge possibility for Pakistan to make very rapid progress were it possible for there to be political attention, focused priority, and to unleash some of the entrepreneurship which is already in place and working. Critical to the thinking around closing the access gap is integration. Imagining grids that will combine systems that will combine grid-connected energy with off-grid, and systems that will allow much more renewable energy into the system. Lots of thinking about how to manage that from the perspective of a rural electrification policy, rural electrification bodies, but also how to think about the provision of electricity services from non-electricity policy options. We can see from Selco and others that there's enormous innovation, in particular in India, around providing electricity from healthcare and education systems rather than interventions which are energy in their nature. So if you can put solar panels on the roof of a school and induce parents to send their children to school because they will be able to charge different devices, and then the kid gets educated and you get access to basic energy services, then we're starting to look at the provision of electricity services through something other than the regulation or policy around energy. And this bundling of services, in particular for the abject poor and for the bottom of the pyramid, is something that really is where policy could help. If in South Asia we've seen the provision of healthcare services through biometric data access, we've seen provision of health payments through all kinds of different ways of getting over and around the sort of graft of the traditional healthcare system, then we can imagine that somebody who needs to obtain a rupee payment for bringing their child to a postnatal clinic could also get access to some kind of clean cooking fuel at that moment. So where does the person interact with the policy, and can that be bundled, and can we actually provide safer, cleaner energy services to those without them at the bottom of the pyramid that way? There is a missing middle of finance in providing access to energy services. The traditional problem of development that those without assets find it very difficult to access finance is also true to access finance for energy services. In India in particular, the role of the state banks is something I'm going to come back to in a moment when I start talking about coal. But it isn't that there isn't finance in the system. It's simply a question of how do you allow those who are living on a very small income a day be able to use those funds for the services that they need. Obviously, there's been huge breakthroughs in using the systems in East Africa around Safaricom's innovation and pay-as-you-go cell phone banking activity. We've not seen that go to scale in South Asia. And it's interesting to really examine why that is. Now, we shouldn't oversubscribe success to East Africa either. I can name for you the sort of 10 or 11 firms that are attracting international finance, attracting equity and debt, and providing a real revolution in the way that poor families are accessing energy services. But I can name them for you, and people in this room can name them for me. There aren't so many that we can't even remember. And the rate of penetration into the domestic markets is slowing down, so there's something happening. The access to finance for these companies is also slowing down. The numbers aren't quite working for the next generation of equity investors. The actual electricity they're providing is expensive. It's better than the alternative, but is it at the right price to scale? These are all questions that we have to get into now as we think about reaching the target by 2030, a target where everyone gets access to electricity. There is enormous innovation in the private sector. There's room for innovation in the financial sector. Policy really matters. Second challenge, energy productivity. Overlooked and unloved is energy efficiency. Why is it not the first lever that everyone reaches for? It is the cheapest and easiest way to bend the emissions curve. There are policy options available to government across all aspects of government. A heavy hand in procurement would make a big difference, and I think we'll start to see that actually in electric vehicle procurement by cities who have to find a way to break through cleaner air provision as they grow rapidly. But energy efficiency requires a total government approach, and it requires somebody to take leadership and somebody to own it, centrally in government and at a significantly high level. We can see from countries that pursue that approach that they make very rapid progress in improving the productivity of energy use across their economy. I think also, despite the moves towards automation, it is a skills-rich sector. And if you think about the people who've got really good jobs in the Midwest across this country, in waste-to-heat power and things like this, I think that there's still something, there's a trick that many cities and states still miss here. We produced heat maps to guide our direction in terms of what is a critical path for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal and what is the critical path to achievement of the Paris Agreement. And of course, there are 20 countries whose energy intensity is much higher than others. That includes much of the OECD, includes Russia, China, India. Some of those 20 countries, those heavily energy-intensive economies, are making rapid progress, but from a very low base. China and India would both fit into those categories. Some of the countries in that group are really not going very far, very fast at all. There's a huge room for improvement, for example, in Russia. The indicators for sustainable energy RISE, a data set put out by the World Bank in conjunction with SE for All, shows very clearly that every country could do better in its policy framework for energy efficiency. When we look at the EU, for example, there is too big a difference between the poorest performing country and the highest performing country. They're all better performing. They're all above 65, which is sort of the cutoff for the highest performing group of countries. But Romania is just sort of at 66, whereas Denmark is at 98. The question for policy is one of positive deviance. What would it take for every Romania to become as good as Denmark? And then what would it take for everybody to become something that even Denmark hasn't imagined yet? That is the scale of the challenge if we are to drive carbon out of the economy, if we are to strive for the energy efficiency that must be available to us. We need to focus on industrial use of energy. Too much time and conversation is spent on efficiency within the actual generation of power. We need to think quite carefully about transport policy. While we are all excited about electric vehicle penetration, what are we going to do about the trucks and buses and the biofuels that they will need as we electrify transportation? We have to think about what the best way to speed up the new buildings that will be passive or positive in giving energy back to the system, and what do we do about the retrofit that is needed in the old cities of this world? A retrofit that will demand that we find the financial solutions to bring the lessor and the lessee closer together. We're talking about stripping buildings out almost completely, leaving just their shell, and rebuilding them to be the kinds of buildings that we need for the future. And we need to speed up the pace with which appliances are becoming super efficient, including all of the appliances that low-income people and low-middle-income people will want to have for the first time over the next decade and a half. So imagine the market for super efficient cooling, super efficient air conditioning, super efficient televisions, radios, fans. These are where large amounts of the efficiency can be achieved. And the markets for those that corner that market are enormous. So it's surprising to me that this isn't a bigger political priority. You could run on this and win. You can provide services to people for less money with greater effect. That's normally something that people would want. So how to make energy efficiency sexy again is a very important challenge for this new initiative. Carbon capture and use, challenge number 3. There isn't an estimation of what the energy mix will look like by mid-century that doesn't imagine that there's going to be a significant piece of that achieved by carbon capture, storage, and use. However, we can see that we are very tangled up around this issue. Just last week, the UK announces that it's back in the carbon capture, storage, and use debate after having quite rudely exited it just a couple of years ago. And just as that happened and people took a deep breath, Norway reversed itself with a cut of 90% of the subsidy into carbon capture, storage and use under the political pressure from the left and centre that this was simply just too expensive. So what do we really think? How are we going to afford it? Who will pay for it? For me, the policy around use is the most important, I think, and perhaps potentially the most exciting. I don't see at the moment much of a market, now or in the future, for capture or storage on its own, but for use, yes. And those people who are investing in the new technologies, the making of gravel and aggregate from carbon, both in the southwest of this country, also in Asia, also in Iceland. These are the interesting applications of that carbon. But who will pay for it? And who will pay for the carbon capture, storage, use, alongside the industrialization in countries that don't yet have it, that aspire to it and are building for it? So who pays for the carbon capture, storage and use shared facility in a major industrial facility that might be built in the middle of Ethiopia or might be built on the coast of Kenya? Is that something that will be set by policy and paid for by the companies? Most steel firms or cement firms are running at very short margins, very thin margins. So is that something that public will pay for? Is that something industry will pay for? Is that something that development should pay for? These are things that need to be worked on and need to be worked on now. Challenge number 4, coal. The tussle over coal continues. I just want to make very clear, it is not cheap. It is not waiting to provide energy to poor people. once public policy lays the way. It could have done that 100 years ago if that was the goal. It is not good for the poor, and it is heavily subsidised. However, coal mining is a proud pursuit. It has sustained generations of proud miners in many countries around the world. That vocation is one that comes with all kinds of cultural advantages. It was a good thing to be for generations. And the carpet has been ripped out from underneath these people, their communities, and their sense of self-worth and their sense of being. That is the job of transition, of good transition economics, of good debate and public policy, and of the application of support from the public purse, perhaps. I lived through this in the 1980s. My father was directly affected by it. I lived through it with the fall of the Iron Curtain. We know how to help communities through transition. That is what this is. Delaying the debate on that or portraying it as anything else is simply diverting us from the job that's really in hand. In India, of course, the tussle over coal plays out every day and has got very exciting in the last month again. I think here it's not just coal, no coal, price and rolling out scenarios for the future. It also means dealing with the overexposure of the state banks to the coal sector and very difficult conversations around the cabinet table about where government supports and where government doesn't. I think from a development perspective, what is alarming is that it is still possible for countries to be persuaded that there is cheap, out-of-the-box technology with international financial subsidy available to them to build a pop-up coal-fired power plant, an IPP, where they need it, and that can happen more quickly, more reliably, and with greater ease than the alternatives which may be on offer. And it is for the international community to come together and offer a better alternative, not just an analysis. And so for Vietnam and for Pakistan and for Bangladesh and for the Philippines and for Kenya and for Nigeria and for other countries across Africa, the international community has to be able to show a pathway forward with available finance for those alternatives in order to prevent a sort of last gasp of the coal industry from diverting us from the pathway that we must follow. The fifth challenge, finance. Infrastructure finance has been a sorry story for a long time, and the complete inability of the international community to use an era of low interest rates for the benefit of the kind of sustainable infrastructure that is needed is one of the things that we will look back on as one of the most enormous missed opportunities of the last decade. But now we begin to see signs of life. There's a rise of national development banks, a rise of green banks across the developing world, where countries try to find ways to use their own resources to invest where the international development resources simply won't go or can't reach today. I think there's an enormous fascination with the idea that there's all this trapped capital in the pension funds and long-term investors of the developed world, and that somehow there's just a couple of magic buttons that need to be pressed and all that money will sort of find its way to large-scale infrastructure projects or small-scale infrastructure projects in developing countries. That's not going to happen now or anytime soon. And so the conversation around domestic investment increasing, how to have development finance be less conservative than it is at the moment, more risk-taking, and what the political tolerance for that needs to be. These seem to be more important avenues. And then as we improve the opportunities in developing countries, as their investment climates improve, as their plans and their prognosis improves, then I think we start to see more pari passu investment, perhaps from new pools of capital. At the same time, I think there is also a real problem in that the financial system prices in what it knows. And so it doesn't matter that wind technology is now cheaper than coal. It doesn't matter that the price of solar is less than 3 cents a kilowatt hour without subsidy. It's still a new technology in the minds of financial investors, and there is a pricing in of what they know that is in effect. 2 weeks ago, we published, as SE for All, a publication called Energizing Finance, where we tracked finance flows for access. And we took everybody at their word, which was that they were really serious about achieving these goals in 2030. And we started to look at international financial flows, private and public, domestic financial flows, private and public. And we looked also at philanthropy and other pools of capital. The short story is that half of what's needed is flowing, but it's only being sort of committed. It hasn't necessarily been dispersed. Most of it flows into highly populous countries, Philippines, Bangladesh, India. Of the 15 sub-Saharan African countries that account for a large part of those billion that don't have access, 1% of the financial flows actually go to those countries. And we see that there is energy in the private equity field. We see that there is starting to be an availability of long-term working capital debt. But we don't see that at volume. And it's going to be very difficult to close a gap for 3 billion people without clean fuels for cooking on the kinds of financial flows that we saw. And so this allows us to have a much more particular conversation with that pipeline problem than just sort of generically talking about the need for more finance. The sixth challenge is one of mindset, institutions, and transparency. In brief, we are moving from a world of static, centralized energy systems with fossil fuel power coming in, reaching as far as they can, to a world of distributed and integrated grid and off-grid fossil and modern fuels. But basically, we're talking about a set of energy systems that will be decarbonized, decentralized, and digitalized. In essence, put those three things together, we're talking about a democratization of the way in which people achieve their energy service needs. That can be extremely exciting. It can be terrifying for regulators and for institutional managers in the old energy system. This is something that I think is a huge opportunity for initiatives like this to ponder and delve into. So we now see more and more energy plans coming forward from countries trying to meet their Sustainable Development Goal targets, meeting their NDC targets under the Paris Agreement, or meeting the campaign pledges of their president or prime minister. Those goals, those plans are much better than the generation before. Countries that set long-term goals, like the 2040 plan in India, have much more opportunity to trade off some of the short-term, medium-term tensions. The RISE indicators that I already mentioned provide a way for countries to benchmark themselves and understand how their neighbours may have done better. And there is a need to be coherent, not to throw bad money after good. The need for coherence is not just a problem for developing countries. The incoherence in the way in which subsidies, trade promotion, export credits, and other instruments are used by the G7 and the G20 is simply out of line with the commitments that were made in Paris and in the SDGs. It has no place in the kind of energy transition we want to move through, and failing to set clear and aggressive targets for the rollout or for the wipeout of these subsidies and other perverse policy instruments is simply standing in the way of the progress that developing countries need to make. And finally, transparency in this challenge. The Financial Times 2 weeks ago published an article about Shell's very slow journey towards sustainability. What I think is really interesting, actually, is if you look at the oil and gas sector, is that we are in this new generation of innovation, somewhat as we were when BP first became Beyond Petroleum. But the financial markets value these companies more or less the same. So under the Task Force for Financial Disclosure for Climate Change that came out of the FSB and the G20 process, companies will have to say what their scenarios are going out into the future. Shell's scenario for mid-century energy mix is that 40% will be renewables. Chevron's scenario for the mid-century energy mix is that about 4%, which is currently where we are, will be renewables. So you have two oil and gas companies that have very, very different views of the future. And they are valued exactly the same. Well, more or less. Huh? So what is it going to be, and how does that lead to a different discussion between investors, shareholders, firms, and eventually regulators? Seventh and final challenge, the furthest to reach. The bargain that was struck in Paris, the bargain that was struck under the Sustainable Development Goals, is one of universality, one of inclusivity. We didn't say that we could drive the economy to be decarbonised on the backs of just a few, on the backs of the many, just for the few. What we said was that we would leave no one behind. And so we have to decarbonise the economy and make it more inclusive. That means that focusing on those that are traditionally beyond the energy system, either below the energy lines or beyond them, is actually something that has to be front of mind in policy making. The 3 billion people who can't cook without endangering their children's health have to be front of mind. What does the biofuels market look like for the future? How do we build big markets for clean fuels and understand how the traditional biomass is not serving us and leading to greater deforestation and leading to 6 million deaths a year? How do you bundle services for the poorest of the poor? And how do you reach women who are the face of that particular piece of the problem? The energy transition is going to power the way to the economic transformation needed to decarbonise an economy that is more inclusive. Time is our enemy, and we have therefore no time to lose. I hope that this initiative here at SAIS can help, together with others, usher in a new generation of policymakers and policies that see that the provision of energy services is very different in the future than the way that we provided them in the past, that centralised fossil-fueled utility model of the past. If this initiative can help in this big stumbling block going forward, it will play a very important role in what I consider to be one of the greatest pivots of our time, one of the greatest challenges that we face. Thank you very much indeed. Let me stay here.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming. It means a lot to me and to all of us that you're all here. It's really exciting to launch this initiative here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And of course, I'll have to thank Dean Nasser for his excellent leadership and welcoming me here at SAIS. It's been a terrific opportunity to launch this initiative with the full support of the school's leadership, so I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank Ms. Kite for excellent remarks. I think those 7 challenges really give us a great understanding of what we are facing and what needs to be done here. And I strongly want to encourage everybody to read those energizing finance reports that Ms. Kite mentioned. They're really excellent research, and for any SAIS students here in the room, they really show how high-quality research is different from low-quality research and how you can really make a difference by doing your homework and getting your numbers right. So it's really excellent work there. To tell you very briefly about ISEP, we already heard from the Dean about our basic idea, but we are really an initiative that tries to bring together these concerns about environmental sustainability and energy access. So we see these as 2 sides of the same coin. It's really a challenge that we all need to face. I don't think there is any realistic pathway for the world to solve the problem of climate change without at the same time solving the problem of energy access. that these two things go hand in hand. And that's largely because the world economy is undergoing this fundamental transformation where the growth potential is really mostly coming now from countries that in the past did not play an important role in this. So South Asia is where I study. That's right now the sort of most important area for the growth of the world economy and where the most important opportunities and challenges are faced. Where to give this talk again in 20 years, we would probably be talking a lot more about how exciting the sub-Saharan African markets are and how all these countries are booming, and that's where the investment opportunities are. So I think it's very clear that as these countries grow, how they produce their economy, their energy for their economy is going to be critical for dealing with the challenge of climate change. So that's why we are trying to, at ISEP, work on these two different issues. A few things that I think make ISEP different and unique compared to what is already out there is one is that we are really focused on this specific programmatic issue. There are many energy initiatives in the world at universities and outside them, but we have a very firm focus on one key issue, which is how to provide sustainable energy access to people. So we think that's, like Ms. Kite said, one of the most fundamental pivots and transformation we are seeing. So we want to focus on that. We want to retain a very sharp focus on this important issue. We are an academic initiative, so we put a very high premium for the quality of the evidence that we use. So we want to do high quality research, and then we want to communicate that high quality research to policymakers, to civil society, to governments, and really make sure that we do our homework and everything we recommend or everything we object to, everything we propose is based on the best knowledge out there that either we have generated or we have found other people generating. We try to take the full sort of arc of debate. So we start with ideas. One of the things we'd like to do is we'd love to welcome many policymakers at the very early stage. As an academic, I've noticed that often the academic research ideas are much too driven by what other academics think are important rather than what the real challenges that policymakers are facing. So we want to start from that very first stage in changing the way we do things. We do research, and then we do the outreach where we try to communicate our findings in a way that a busy government official can understand and can use in their work. Because again, I think there is this clear understanding that academics, researchers, policymakers need to work together, but if you ask academics how to do that, they'd say, well, the policymakers need to listen more to us. They need to read our randomized controlled trials. If you ask the policymakers, they tell us academics, why are you not telling us what we need to know? We need a one-pager on a key issue, and let's take it from there, right? So we want to bridge this gap by taking both sides seriously. We are an interdisciplinary group, so even though I have a background in political science, we have in our group people from behavioral economics, we have political scientists, we have engineers, we have computer scientists, we have people working on integrated assessment models, we have a lot of practitioners in our team. So we really want to make sure that we take insights from different disciplines instead of being driven by what might be my own bias or my own background. In terms of projects that we are currently doing, so we've started the work. This is the official launch, but that, as you all know, happens a few months after the real work has begun. So I want to tell you about a few concrete projects that we are working on right now. And the first one is we just very recently finalized a project design with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is our co-partner in India, on some work on the power sector in Uttar Pradesh, which is India's largest state, a population 200 million. And there we work to deal with issues like electricity theft, improving the pricing policies of electricity, and how to reform these utilities that are supposed to provide this energy. So that's a very exciting initiative because we get to work directly in a core state where 40% of India's non-electrified households are currently found, and we work with the state government and with local partners. So that's a very exciting initiative for us. Another one that we literally signed last week is with the Rockefeller Foundation's Smart Power Initiative in India. So the Rockefeller Foundation has played a very important role in promoting awareness and practice of decentralized energy. And so we recently signed a contract with them to do a very large study combining surveys and field experiments on understanding what are the barriers to further growth, what is the potential for these systems to provide energy to households, to enterprises. So this is a program that over the 2 years I think is going to provide some very exciting new insights and allow us to move forward dealing with this challenge. And the third one, Ms. Kite mentioned coal in her remarks, is that we have a new initiative or program I should say, since we are an initiative, where we try to collect very precise data on the location, timing, and technical details of all coal-fired power plants in the world. And we use that to understand, first of all, what are the impacts of the pollution that coal-fired power plants generate, how do governments make siting decisions, where are these coal-fired power plants placed, and what could be done to facilitate and speed up this transition away from coal in a way that's beneficial to the society. Those are 3 current projects that we are just starting now, and in the future we of course hope to start many, many more of these. We like to think of us as a pretty active group here. We have a great team, and I'm very pleased to introduce 2 of my associate directors. So Mr. S.P. Harish, who is our director of our behavioral lab. So one thing we take very seriously in this initiative is that we try to understand how people make decisions about energy. So we do all these different experiments on electricity use, demand for off-grid alternatives, willingness to pay for electricity, clean cooking fuels, and for that we need expertise in behavioral research. And I'm very proud to have Mr. Harish with me because he's really one of the sort of most dynamic and competent researchers in this field. I'm also happy to have Mr. Rustam Sengupta here, who is our practitioner. He's a good friend from a long time back. He was the CEO of Bund Engineering and Development, a Delhi-based social enterprise that was one of the first to scale up the sales, distribution, and the business model for solar home systems and microgrids. If you go to Delhi, you can see solar panels on the top of all these metro stations, and Bund has been responsible for building many of these. If you go to Uttar Pradesh or Rajasthan, you can find their systems, their microgrids, their solar home systems on many, many roofs, and it's very exciting to be working directly with practitioners because that's something I think we academics just don't do nearly enough. Unfortunately, my good friend and colleague Ryan Kennedy, who is our Associate Director for Analytics, could not be here because of personal reasons, but he's obviously very excited about this initiative and puts a huge amount of work into helping us get going. So clearly with this team, I think the future is bright for us. We also have a great fellows program, so we have a number of academics who have agreed to join us. A few of those are in this room, and I'm not going to mention any names, not because there's anything wrong with it, but in the interest of time, but I want to thank all of you for joining us. It's really exciting to have you. We also have a student fellow program where we, again, have a number of student fellows here in the room who have joined us and who are, I think, the future of this field. Certainly, we are going through this momentous transformation. There's a lot of new things we need to learn, and many things we learned about energy in the 20th century just aren't going to be the future. So that's why I think the sort of younger generation is really going to play a very important role in this initiative. We have great senior advisors. We have Jason Bordov, David Victor, we have Ruth de Vries, who are advising us on these issues. We have Peter Lund from Aalto University back home in Finland, and then Aruna Bagosh, who's the CEO of Council of Energy, Environment and Water, and our core partner. So these 5 top thinkers and leaders in energy will really provide us with excellent advice and useful insights. We also have a number of partners. So we have a partnership with CW, with many other organizations. One that I specifically want to mention is Power for All, which is similar to SE for All, is very deeply committed to helping people gain access to energy. And they've been very helpful with us, sort of thinking through how we can take our insights and get them to the public debate, to policymakers, because they really have an excellent media and communications team who knows how to get these lessons there. And finally, I want to mention is, so even though we are an academic institution, we also have an advisory services arm that we are setting up right now. So we are interested not only in research projects that result in published articles, we are also ready to help any policymakers, private sector design their policies in that role. And that's something that we think is very exciting. I'll finish my remarks before we start the discussion with just a call for everybody to get involved. So if you are a researcher, practitioner, student, please join us. We want to grow our initiative. We want to bring in a lot of new talent and energy. So if anybody is interested, don't hesitate to get in touch. You'll find me quite easily online. Send me an email and let's see how you can help us and how we can help you. If you are a policymaker or practitioner, we'd love to partner with you because we really need your insights on what we as an initiative should study, what are the key issues, and how we can help you. So please help us. And of course, as a new initiative, we do need some funding and support. So if there are any funders, foundations, corporations here who think this is an important cause, please do help us because we need some resources to grow our initiative in the coming years. And with that, I'll again thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to welcome Ms. Kai to join me for a discussion. Please. All right, so we've got another half an hour left. So I want to open with a few questions inspired by today's remarks and also the Energizing Finance reports which I read this weekend in preparation of this event. And I know that Mr. Sengupta also has an important question that he wants to ask as a practitioner. And then after that, I'll open it for the audience and we can hopefully have a good discussion. So my first question, I have to ask this because I study off-grid and decentralized energy, is on the role of decentralized solutions in this whole transition. As we know from the Energizing Finance report and as we know from lots of research that has been done, the decentralized energy, especially in electricity, works very differently from the centralized energy. So we know that the cost of setting up this system is often much lower, especially in places where you do not have grid infrastructure. But at the same time, if you start scaling up the energy use, it still remains the fact that the cost of doing that with decentralized is higher than using, for example, centralized, whether it's natural gas, solar, or wind. So what I'd like to ask is, how do you see this decentralized energy and electricity in particular playing a role in this big picture where we are trying to get everybody affordable and abundant energy in a sustainable way?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think there's sort of two pieces to that answer. One is that there are all kinds of sunken subsidies and finance that has flowed over the years and continues to flow into the grid, which until very recently, right, the obsession was making sure that the price of what came out of the grid was one that was politically acceptable to the people that elected you to office, right? And so therefore, in many cases, the growth of off-grid has been interrupted by all kinds of perversities around public, so you're getting power from a mini grid and it's 2 cents a kilowatt hour more than what your cousin in the next city is getting from the grid, and that that sets off a debate, and then the politician comes in and shuts it down because they don't want that to be a backlash. So that there's the politics of how the price has been set centrally and then how prices are achieved from distributed energy is very complex and needs to be sort of understood and unwoven. We're doing an additional piece of work that builds on to the work on energizing finance, which we're hoping to launch in November, which is on what we call the energy dividend. And we're doing it in conjunction with a number of different partners. So what we do is we commission and engage ourselves in the evidence where the evidence is missing. And this is very much around what is the economic dividend from achieving access early. So it's not about whether you've got exact price parity between the grid and off-grid, but if you were to achieve access early, and that can be achieved by rolling out off-grid or distributed options, what is the economic return on that? What is the development return? What's the health outcome return, the education outcome return? Now, I can't exactly prejudge what that report's going to say. It's in sort of like, it's in iteration at the moment. But I think it's going to say something very profound about savings, both at the household level and to authorities. And it's going to say something then, in addition, around economic benefits, health benefits, education benefits. And I think we're looking at, if you have a choice of rolling it out and achieving some kind of access through off-grid models in the next 2 to 3 years versus 15 years, which is when IEA says that you're going to get to that point. And that's 10 years of the kids in that town's education, then I think that's going to start to become profound. So watch this space. But I think we have to come at it from both directions.
Those are very interesting insights. In the academic research, we call this, what Ms. Kite said first, all these sort of massive investments in the grid infrastructure over time, we call it the carbon lock-in, where the infrastructure has been designed for a very different way of generating energy from what we need in the future. So in some sense, the playing field is not very even here. It's really sort of biased in that sense, and that creates additional difficulties. If we started from an empty field where there are no power plants, we would probably see something very different from what we have today. The energy dividend, I'm really looking forward to that report because it says something important, that the choice for these communities is often not grid versus off-grid, it is off-grid versus nothing. And if that is the case, if you have to wait 10 to 15 years in a remote village, then the calculus becomes very different, right? And this is something where I think it's important to keep in mind also this fundamental difference between most of the South Asian countries and the Sub-Saharan African countries, because in South Asian economies, the grid is typically nearby. India, for example, there's only a handful of villages left that don't have a grid connection, whereas in many Sub-Saharan African countries, most villages remain unelectrified.
But then what's really interesting, right, in South Asia is that, yes, the grid is arriving at the villages, and you can go on the Twitter feed, or at least you could under the previous energy minister, and see how quickly it was going, and you can go on the web and you can see village by village who's connected. And then there's the question of whether anybody's using the electricity. And then obviously you've got also the twin initiative of providing LPG gas for cooking as a clean fuel, and then the question of does anybody actually, past the arrival of the first canister, actually replace their canister or refill their canister, and so then this is where the behavioural, so what is actually going on? Is it just a factor of price? Is there something else happening? So I think that in our critique of India, by our critique, I mean the international community's critique of India. On the one hand, you've got everything that you would dream of, right? You've got leadership from the top, everybody's going to be connected. You've got passion and dynamism in the bureaucracy and in certain ministerial portfolios. But that's still got to translate into people actually being able to avail themselves of the service. And I think that's going to be the interesting story over the next year or so, is that turning into energy services acquired and development impact achieved.
That's exactly right. I think it's very clear looking at the Indian public debate as well. It's starting to move away from just counting village connections or household connections into what are we actually achieving, what kind of service are we providing, and how will it evolve in the future. The second question I wanted to ask reflects your discussion of coal. And here we see obviously some good news. We see good news in the sense that the growth of coal production and consumption has stopped, and in recent years it may have even started to decline. We'll have to see how sustained that decline is, but certainly the scenario is a lot better than it would have been 5 to 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But what I want to ask then is, we still have a long way to go. We need to bend the emissions curve. So do you have any thoughts on how to deal with existing infrastructure? If we have these coal-fired power plants that are already running, the capital is there, how can we, with policy, facilitate the transition away from those, setting aside the sort of need to reduce the construction of new power plants?
So I think it's, well, first of all, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's different. It's different depending on what. So so Germany's transition away from coal over the next few years, and wherever whatever kind of government they end up getting, how quickly that government commits to doing that is, it's going to be somewhat different than what Vietnam's choices are. And it depends upon what the energy resource available to you is and how that can be managed. Nuclear, obviously, is an option that some countries are pursuing. Got a very interesting dynamic in Japan, versus countries where that's not going to be part of the mix. Pakistan's story is different from Bangladesh's, but I think that what I would say is that what I would hope to see happening is that the policy community and the financial community, and that includes the MDBs, work collectively together in support of government's transition. So, I think it's you've got to have the AIIB, ADB, and the World Bank working as one in order to have the technical expertise and the capital and whatever else, the clout necessary to help the government through the transition. And of course, if they've got major shareholders of those banks and major companies from major shareholders of those banks, going in the revolving door as they come out, offering something cheaper and easier, that has to be resolved in the capitals of those major shareholders, and it has to be resolved around the G20 dining room table and around the G7 dining room table. And I think my call and the call of many others is stop the merry-go-round. We can all see what's going on. It doesn't make any sense, and let's fix it. Rather, even 2 or 3 years ago, it's like, well, how much coal would be in the mix for how long? That we are past that point, right? This is not going to be part of the future. And so we have a responsibility to help people who have got a foot, in a brown economy and have got a foot in coal and have coal deposits available to them. That's a responsibility. Are we going to pay them to leave it in the ground? Maybe that's the cheapest option for some countries, but then we've got to make something else available. So I think it's enough already is really kind of where I'm at. With the greatest respect to those who have proudly got us to this point in our history on the back of coal.
All right, excellent. I think I again want to emphasize that how different this was just 5 years ago. We were not talking about the idea of starting to reduce coal use globally 5 years ago. The question was, how much can we prevent it from reducing? So this is, I think, one of the bright spots besides the growth of renewables in the energy mix that we see in there.
And I think what's also different now is that you've got a different actor, that you've got different actors at the table. You've now got a generation of mayors and municipal leaders who cannot imagine how they can grow with the air quality that is projected, right? And this is developed and developing, and I think that they're a force now that they just weren't before. And so the whole debate around air quality in a fastly urbanizing world, I think has given a new edge to it as well, I think.
That's exactly right. So certainly air pollution has become a much bigger debate of discussion, and it's related to the fact that our world is rapidly urbanizing. And if you have very dense populations living in these urban centers trying to create a dynamic economy and live a healthy and productive life, then a coal-fired power plant is not necessarily what you want to have in your neighborhood. And many of these new leaders, local leaders, realize this, that their own survival in office and politically depends on providing people with better air quality and environmental services. The last question I want to ask before we open it, we hear Rustam's question and open it to the audience, relates to cooking fuels. So one of the challenges that we saw in the Energizing Finance report was that cooking fuels in particular are not currently receiving these sort of large investment flows. And we know also from some of the math in those reports that the cost of providing people with access to cooking fuels and making them affordable, clean cooking fuels, making them affordable so that people actually use them is actually going to be a major challenge. So what I wanted to know is, what are some interesting, exciting opportunities or some new horizons emerging on cooking fuels in particular? How do we solve the problem that 3 billion people are cooking in a way that's putting their own and their children's health in danger?
So that's really good. So I think that I think it's very interesting how we arrived at this point in time with only this amount of progress. So, you know, this is not a new issue. I mean, it's almost a decade since Hillary Clinton sort of stood up as Secretary of State and said, look, this is a priority. There's enormous amount of organising around the world, huge amounts of data collected and academic studies, etc. You've got, you know, sort of parts of the gas industry organised on this theme. You've got the movement for clean cook stoves, sort of enhanced cook stoves, so you're using much less biomass. And I think that, you know, that there was a little sort of what do you call it, a diversion while we had a big fight about how clean a cook stove had to be in order to be clean, and that's important, but shouldn't put us off the general direction of what we're trying to do. And I think that we got a little obsessed with the actual cook stove as opposed to the fuels. So 95% of the cost is actually in the fuels, right? The stove is actually, you know, it's something you can almost give away with the fuel if you got it right. The other thing is, I think that because this is very much a problem that is fronted by women, we of course didn't take their views into account. So I cook with a microwave, I have a gas hob, and I have an electric oven. And if it's really nice and the bugs are under control, I even have a barbecue, you know. Now, I'm going to choose what I cook, where, depending on how I want to cook and how I want it to taste. Right? I am no different than any other mother. And why do we think that other women are different than we are? They're not, right? So this has to be about getting them a range of affordable, clean fuels, and then the devices that they can use off that, right? Now, you've got all of the social problems, you know, the husband who doesn't want his chapati cooked this way but that way, you know, the husband who's fed up because this new stove means he has to go out and find little twigs, not big twigs. I've talked to these men, I've heard them complain, I understand the problem. So that's a real piece of it as well. But the other big piece of it is that the 4 to 5 hours over the course of a couple of days, or, you know, the accumulative hours of a woman's life that is lost to sourcing traditional biomass is simply not counted and is given no economic value. I mean, suddenly if you could free up tens of hours of productive use and use them for something else, then maybe that would start becoming a higher political priority. So the good news is that we are where we are, we know all of this, and I think that we can actually reach a point where we can start looking at what are the big markets for clean fuels and the opportunities that lie therein. That was a message I took to Marrakesh, to the World LPGA meeting just 10 days ago, and I'm going to India next week for the Clean Cook Stoves meeting. I'm trying to get these groups to sort of, rather than sort of, you know, I'm right, you're wrong, no, I'm right, you're wrong, or, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. There is room for everybody in this market. It's 3 billion people who need access to clean fuels for cooking. There's room for everybody to be a hero there.
All right, excellent. Cooking fuels and clean cooking certainly are going to be big priorities for ISEP as well in the future. We are currently trying to design a set of interventions and studies and a work program that will help us get there and understand, in particular, the behavioral aspects. That's where we think we can provide some real value. So I'm done with my 3 questions. I think these were very insightful answers, and I learned a lot from this. So Rustam, do you want to ask your question next, and then I'll open it to the audience?
Hi. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that, well, first of all, my job is to be, you know, sort of the favourite aunt of the practitioners network, right? So my job is to go out and say, these people are wonderful, you should pay attention and finance them, and also then turn around to you and go like this when I think you're not paying attention. So so I stand on your shoulders, not the other way around. So I think what's really interesting is that there are all these amazing companies that have achieved the growth that they have and the financial stability that they have, and they're not all that stable sometimes, despite, you know, despite everything, not because. So if you think about 1 billion people without access to electricity, and you think that the opportunity because of the price of technology and because of financial engineering and because of business models is that they could get access now through distributed models, which 10 years ago seemed like a pipe dream and now is a reality. That's a market, and yet we see very little investment in building that market or creating the market. So if you were creating the market, you would sink all kinds of funding into lots of market surveys, lots of data and research that would benefit anybody entering that market. But these companies have grown up in the absence of all of that, and most of that kind of work they had to front load, so it's a capital cost to them as they are at a very, very, very early stage of growth. They've also, because of the availability of finance, so the multilateral development banks, the bilaterals were not putting in basic market enabling funding. They were deciding in London or Berlin or here or whatever, oh, we like solar home systems. And so if you wanted to do a solar home system business, then maybe you could get some financing. But they weren't saying, we believe in distributed solutions and let the market choose which one would work. So that was going on. And then secondly, the only available finance was, thank goodness, you know, people who really saw the future, but they were offering expensive equity. And that's meant that a lot of these firms have grown vertically. They're vertically integrated, and they shouldn't be. In a market, you would be seeing lots of horizontal business models. I'll deal with this segment of the market, and somebody else deals with this, and somebody else deals with that. Isn't what's happened. And I think what's going to happen now is that as people begin to understand that you've got this enormous market opportunity, we have to translate this moment into funding coming in at large for market creation. And then we're going to have to weather a period where some of these vertical firms are not going to make it, or they merge, and new firms come to the fore. What's going to be very interesting is to watch the development community at that moment, because the development community doesn't take failure very well, despite all of the seminars about failure, right? Because that means that you have to sit in front of the parliamentary committee or the oversight body or whatever and say, you know what, this didn't work. Well, yes, it didn't work because we were building a market and some things don't work. And 8 out of 10 small businesses normally don't succeed, but 2 will, and they will be transformative. So I think we're at that point now. And what I hope is that through energizing finance and other pieces of data and research, through your work, we can enable, you know, a market creation attitude rather than a project by project, business model by business model, you know, development practitioners picking technology winners, which is never a good thing.
So that's an excellent point. And I want to, from my perspective, also emphasize that it is important to remember that this is a new industry, that we really are looking at maybe past 5 to 10 years of development, and there are very few industries in history that have, in 5 years, just, you know, taken off and had billions and billions of users and customers and, you know, great bottom line. So we are at the early stage, and this spirit of experimentation and willing to accept failures and learning from them, I think is going to be very important. So we still have some time, so I wanted to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions or comments. for us. Okay, so let's start with the gentleman here.
And the Emerge Alliance. And thank you very much for that commentary today. That's the most comprehensive view that I've seen that fits my model of the world. I appreciate that very much. What role do you see for blockchain and cryptocurrencies in facilitating what you're trying to do?
So, as far as I can see at the moment, the most excitement and innovation around blockchain is in financial services. And I think that there is therefore a natural touch point between the ability to provide financial services cheaply to those with low incomes and then their ability to access services. I haven't seen it come over yet into service provision, but I would imagine that that's just a matter of time. And so when I was at the International Finance Corporation, we did a lot on access to finance then and how you could secure, lowering of the transaction cost, basically breaking the back of the banking model because banks weren't going to be able to provide those services, and the rise of non-banking financial institutions. And I think that that's what you're seeing now with the energy services, the solar home systems in East Africa, etc. I mean, these are, it's minutes on your telephone, it's money on your phone, it's other things. I think there's still a problem to go to scale. There's still a problem for women. So women have access to phones. They can't have, even when they can't get access to an energy bill or to a bank account. But it hasn't. We haven't sort of with one sweep of the wand solved all problems yet. So I think there's really potential there, but it's very early days. But something to be pursued.
Excellent.
Sorry.
Faulkner, president of Leatherstocking and a SICE grad. You've talked about both biofuels and green electricity, but the sustainability challenges of those two are quite distinct in some ways. And in that vein, I wonder if you could muse a little bit about the role of agriculture modernization or growth of food production for helping the global bioeconomy grow.
So, I think there's a couple of, the sort of theory of change that you hear predominantly now is that is the idea that you electrify everything and the electricity is zero carbon, right? So that we decarbonize the electricity system and then we electrify everything, and that's the way that we get onto the curve that we need to be on. There are parts of the economy where that's less likely in the medium term, right? So shipping, aviation, and other, and then there are parts of the world where sustainable biofuels could be a part of the solution. So there's a significant international sort of sustainable biofuels effort now being led by Brazil, although they're not having. Let's see how this happens over the next few months, given what's going on in Brazil. But traditionally, in the international political level, both India and Brazil have had an interest in keeping the biofuels debate, there and not having biofuels drop out of the equation. And then it's been for the US under the Obama administration, in the UK and others, to make sure sustainable was in front of biofuels in every sentence and to sort of argue around that. There are a couple of big hiccups, I think, still, and actually one maybe that we should talk about in terms of future work. So one is that the accounting is really bad. So this is the actual accounting of the carbon emissions that come from something that's grown for grown in general, and then grown for biofuels. So the accounting doesn't really cope with the methane that is emitted when you dig the tree up, right? And then there's what you do with the tree, and then you turn it into a wood chip, and then you put it in a boat and you send it across to Liverpool, and then it goes in a truck and you burn it in a Drax power station, and that's suddenly zero carbon. How can that be zero? So there's a whole lot of stuff that has to happen in the accounting, and I think that now, because I don't think you can just do this on the back of a green electricity system, now would be a time to see whether people would come around a table and be part of a solution. So Bill Mumore, who was my professor at Fletcher, has spent a lot of time on that, and I think that's still work to be done. The second thing I think then is that the aviation industry has got its own pathway forward with sustainable biofuels. The shipping industry is becoming increasingly the focus of attention, and that needs to be sort of kicked a little bit into the future. So there are, I think, big dynamics, and then there's actually the biofuels for cooking and the biofuels that the traditional biomass that people use. And we will be launching a piece of work to look at the size and the dynamics of that market. Because again, people sort of tend to think that people aren't paying anything or using anything. No, I mean, they're paying a lot for traditional biomass, and in some parts of, for example, of West Africa, that's a reasonably mafia-run, business, and so it's not an easy one to unearth. But for every country, depending on where you are, your food security, your energy security, and your water security are where policy has to provide some sense of enlightenment. And that's different if you're Brazil than if you are Mexico, than if you are Cameroon, than if you are India. But and the availability of sustainable biofuels is different. But I think that it's only in certain cases that can be sustainable for fuel. And I think it's only under careful management with careful accounting that we know that we're really doing good and not bad. So lots of work to do before that can really move forward safely at speed, I think.
Excellent.
Thanks. Pasha Madavi, I'm a professor over at Georgetown. And thanks for this event and for the talk itself. I wanted to ask you about carbon capture in particular, your third point, and two kind of critical challenges that seem to be in play at the moment. One is this so-called implementation gap, right? The difference between planned projects in carbon capture and completed projects in carbon capture. And the second one having to do with price. Right, this is a technology that's been around for decades, right? And we're still at $25 to $35 per ton without taking into account, EOR, enhanced oil recovery, things like that. So what can multilateral groups like SE4All, like Mission Innovation, and others do to address these two challenges in carbon capture? And by the way, I think you're absolutely right. The viability is CCU, obviously not CCS. I think that's absolutely right. But what can be done to try to address these two existing challenges? Thanks.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I suppose if I knew, I would be, ringing the stock exchange bell or something. But so first of all, as in many other fields, right? If you reverse yourself as the government on policy, it will have a chill effect. And look what happened to the UK a couple of years ago when suddenly, we weren't into carbon capture anymore. And then look at the sort of, reaction to Norway's decision last week. So that's just going to send everybody back into their holes, right, for a long time. And I think it was also the same here when, I think it was in May or June, when we were all at the Clean Energy Ministerial in Beijing, and Secretary Perry came out and said very forcefully, for the United States, this is about, exporting, X, Y, Z, and carbon capture and storage, this is what we want to explore. And then the very next week, the plant very close to Texas, decided that it just wasn't going to be in that was not viable economically. So I think that's something that governments have to deal with. You have to be in this or not in this. But the fact that people are reversing themselves, and they're reversing themselves because of price, then then let's go to price. So there are more and more jurisdictions either putting in place or examining carbon pricing. But in many cases, that carbon pricing is not effective. An effective carbon price is one which, together with other policy measures, contributes to the squeezing out of carbon from the energy system or from the economy. And it's very interesting when you talk to business leaders about what they think an effective price will be. I chaired the World Economic Forum CEOs climate huddle that they have every year in Davos this year. And we put it up for a vote. We've got 65 CEOs from major corporations around the world, and they said that in 2020 they thought it would be around $25. By 2025 it would be just a little bit more, and then by 2030 it would be around 30. And I'm like, well, okay, that's not effective. So are you saying that you don't believe that there will be effective carbon pricing, because you're all saying that we need effective carbon pricing, and you're all part of coalitions designed to do it? So I think that there is, a constant wavering around this. The business community is pretty clear that it wishes to see an ever ratcheting up, ever more inclusive set of carbon prices around the world. Certainly that helps gas over coal. So within the oil and gas industry, they're very keen on it. It helps everybody, really. Provides you with that long-term signal. Difficult to do, yes. If China pulls off its experiment at the end of this year, then I think that will have an effect. But it isn't moving as fast as we wanted to. The Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition was created 2 years ago to make this a political thing, not just a technical thing. They need to sort of pull their boots back on again and get out there. And there needs to be political leadership, and people have to enlist each other. We are living in an age of distraction, whether it's what's going on in this country or Brexit or whatever. And, it's focus people, right, is the second sort of, message I would leave everybody with.
Excellent. So I'm well aware that everybody is busy, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to join us for this event. Let's thank Ms. Kite one more time for excellent remarks.